Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Simple Living High Thinking, where we unpack Tukram Prabhu's Bhagavad Gita class every week. We are towards the end of chapter 4 right now, and just to give a little bit of context and a little bit of a recap, Varangi, what does the listener need to know?
I'll step right in. So today we're going to cover the rest of chapter 4, which was what Tukram Prabhu covered last class. So we'll tie chapter 2, 3, and 4 during this recap, and then we'll dive into more details after the recap. So it was a wonderful recap because from him, obviously, because it really allowed me, and I think you guys would agree, to take a step back and remember the terminology that had been brought up to this point, which mainly was yagya, sacrifice, karma, action or work, and then gyan, knowledge, and how these three terms have evolved through the chapters thus far, and how they're not intertwined, but really connected through this section of the Gita. And so in the second chapter, remember the first chapter is Krishna's or Sanjay is just presenting all the people that are on the battlefield, a bunch of names, and really describing who's fighting against who and the family ties and Arjuna and Krishna. In the second chapter, that's when Krishna starts speaking. And so Krishna really gives an advanced concept of sacrifice during the second chapter with, I would say, with a flavor of theology, or pre-theistic at this point, but it is theological, which was, you're not this body, right? So which means we're spirit souls, therefore that's where the theology comes in. And not only that we are not this body, but we should do our duty, like work in this world, and not be attached to the results or the fruit of our labor. Now, Arjuna had the same reaction that we all did, which was, whoa, okay, you're God. Yeah, that's cool for you. Like, that's doable because you can do it all. But what about for us? You know, I'm attached. You know, I still have so many things I want to do. I have so many goals and dreams in life. And I still want to be a spiritualist. I want to jump in, but can you just take a step back and walk me through this process? And that's exactly what Krishna did. And so in the third chapter, Krishna takes a step back from that advanced, not instruction, because as we've talked about, Krishna doesn't instruct Arjuna. He's just giving him knowledge and letting Arjuna decide, just like all of us, because we do have free will. But in the third chapter, Krishna's taking a step back from that advanced piece of information, which was to do our duty, and not be attached to the fruits of our labor. And in the third chapter, he talks about how, okay, still do your duty, engage in what's right, your responsibilities, and be attached to the fruits of our labor. And the thought process behind that is that as you engaged in doing your duty, you're practicing regulation. And that regulation helps you not waver and not just like be in one day and be out the next and be all over the place and just dive into gratifying your senses and your fickle mind. And so regulation allows us to become steady in this process of self-realization. And also because we are still working and we're attached, at least, and this is introduced in the third chapter, you can offer it to somebody that's something higher than yourself. And that's where the demigods come in, right? And we talked about that concept. So if you need a refresher on what that term means, you can look back to listen to our other episode where we cover that. So, but in general, and the demigods mean somebody that are not God, but are part of God's cabinet, right? The representatives in the material world. And so in doing this, we're still working in this world and we're still getting some fruits and we're still attached to that fruit, but we're offering some of this labor and the fruit of this labor to something higher than ourselves. And eventually, because the demigods are connected to the supreme source of everything. And because that regulation is coming from the Vedas, the person doing this process is eventually going to go to the highest version of sacrifice, which Krishna will explain later on, which ends up being bhakti, or loving service to the Supreme. So this concept was introduced in the third chapter, right? How regulated work and still having internally attachment to that labor, as long as we're offering something to somebody higher or something higher than ourselves, we will eventually develop love and appreciation and gratitude, and we'll want to give up a little more of that attachment. Now, in the fourth chapter, Krishna comes back around, and Tukram explains it as, now Krishna really will dive into what he really wanted to talk about on the second chapter, but he couldn't because we weren't ready for it. And so in the fourth chapter, Krishna jumps right into how yajna is sacrifice. Yajna is the Sanskrit term for sacrifice. How yajna is done, how work is done simply for the purpose of yajna, or sacrifice. No longer for, well, what am I going to get out of it? How much am I going to get to enjoy? But how we work in this world simply for the purpose of being able to offer it back to the source of everything. And so he mentioned text 23, which we covered before, but I think it's a really nice verse, because in this verse, and it says, the work of a man who is unattached to the modes of material nature and who is fully situated in transcendental knowledge merges entirely into transcendence. And this is the verse in which Krishna puts together yajna, gyan, and karma, these three terms that Krishna has been bringing up, and how Krishna in this verse tells us how, instead of viewing these three terms or paths as individual, what he's proposing as the master of everything is that this is a path that can be done together. All these three things can be done in conjunction for spiritual realization. So that was a huge turning point, and a very important verse in this chapter. And then Krishna describes the different activities that the yogis of ancient India engaged in, like meditation, getting married, pranayam, fasting, and a bunch of other different ways in which all these different people engage in sacrifice. So Krishna was actually enlarging or expanding the definition of sacrifice when compared to what yajna was at the beginning of the Gita, which he explained it to be as a fire, actually sacrifice, where you physically use the fruit of your labor to buy stuff to carry out this fire sacrifice, or this ritual in which you gave a lot of your money or bounty to charity in this way, to the priests and all these things. So in the fourth chapter, it's evolved because now Krishna is really honoring all these other practices and saying, look, there's many different types of sacrifice. And if you do all these, or any of these, this will eventually get you to bhakti, or self-realization, really, at this point. And then he makes a hierarchy, and he points to how knowledge, how sacrifice of possessions, although it's good, it's a starting point, is less than using your knowledge or sacrifice in knowledge, right? And this is where Krishna introduces the idea of doing the right thing for the right reason, not just doing the right thing and then maybe for, randomly it's for the right reason, but actually consciously developing and nurturing knowledge so that you do the right thing, but it's now supported by the right reasons. And he really goes into a lot of detail about this point in the class. So please click on his lecture link, because it was really powerful. And he also mentions, Krishna also mentions how we cannot do this process of cultivating knowledge without a spiritual master. This is verse 34. How a spiritual master, a guru, is very important in this process because they have seen the light, right? So this is 34. Just try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master and inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. The self-realized souls can impart knowledge onto you because they have seen the truth. So this is another little formula that Krishna gives us along the way. It's like, yeah, you can do all the things that I have told you about, but also here's a hack to the system. You won't be able to transcend this world unless you get coaching from somebody that knows more than you. And these people, your spiritual masters, have seen the truth. They not only have the knowledge, but they have become that knowledge. They're that walking wisdom, right? And so by rendering service onto them, you're offering an action, right? And then they reciprocate with grace and knowledge. And then I guess that brings us to the conclusion of his recap, which was how we go from doing something that's regulated, like tithing, or going to church once a week, or just doing something pious once a month, or during a certain period of maybe a month during the year. Some traditions do this, but then the rest of the time we're nonsense, right? And we're just fully diving into materialism. And how he says is the same thing, so this is a starting point. It's good, it's better than nothing, but hopefully the goal is to continue on that, and by regulation we'll get to the point where your whole life becomes an offering, our whole life becomes sacrifice, and we can be connected to transcendence in this way by our thoughts, our actions, and by our thoughts and actions become one item to offer to that sacrifice, or yagya, which is obviously a metaphor for the big ritual fire sacrifice that was initially introduced as yagya. So that brings us to today's talk, which is covering verses 39 through the end, which is 42. So, and that will conclude chapter 4. Did I miss anything, or is there anything else that you would want to include in the recap?
I think you did a great job, Varangi. Thank you for that. It was very complete, and it really brought us all the context we need to move forward. I would like to go back and mention something which I believe we never spoke about this time around in Gita, and Tukaram did make a mention to it. And it's all the way back in the beginning of the chapter. This is text 5. That text reads, well, it requires a little bit of context also. So the very first verses of chapter 4, Krishna is telling Arjuna that all that he had taught Arjuna up to the point, which was chapters 2 and 3, he had taught that knowledge to the sun god, which kind of bewilders Arjuna again by saying, hey, the sun god is sooner by birth to you. How can I understand that you taught this to the sun god in the beginning? To which Krishna answers by saying, many, many births, both you and I have passed. I can remember them all, but you cannot. So what Tukaram mentioned here is that this concept that Krishna can remember everything, but we who are inferior than Krishna, we cannot. And it seems like a defect, almost like a curse, because we are so less intelligent than Krishna that we don't have the capacity to remember our previous births. And I certainly looked at it that way. Oh, it's a curse, I'm inferior and therefore I cannot remember. God is distinguished from me, he's all knowledgeable, and therefore he can remember. Well, the point that Tukaram made, which was interesting to me, is that this is not a curse by any means. And in fact, it is a blessing. And the reason why is because according to our scriptures and our understanding, our spiritual understanding, we have taken birth millions and trillions of times, many, many, many times. And imagine what would it be like if we never forgot them, if we never forgot those experiences. it would be, to me, it would be a devastating experience, because I would remember, I would have knowledge of all the previous mistakes I have done, all the wrongdoings. I did not show only people that I love, but just general mistakes. I mean, I can think about the past week, so many mistakes I've done, and I would regret them. So many of these regrets would paralyze me, would not really prevent me from moving forward. And furthermore, so that's one point. In that sense, therefore, this is a blessing that we get a chance to start over, forgetting all mistakes we've made in the past, with a chance to truly, and that's one of the points that really got me, to truly exercise our free will, because otherwise the power of our free will would have been diminished. And then the other point, I don't know if this is necessarily a bad connotation, but it really highlighted one verse that I quoted in a previous class of ours. This is a verse from Bhagavatam, where the conversation there, the speaker says that the true sign of self-realization is the extent to which one have become indifferent to the demands of both the subtle and the physical bodies. And I related this concept again to this verse, and Tukaram also mentioned it. What would happen to our current myopic situation, meaning our work, our families, our likes and our dislikes, if we truly had remembrance of the trillions and trillions and trillions of other times that we have dealt with the situation again and again and again and again, right? All the intricacies of the material world, you would certainly be like, oh, okay, I've seen this movie 1,000 times. I know exactly how it's going to start. I know exactly how it's going to develop. And I know exactly how it's going to end. I would become a little bit indifferent, because it's like, okay, guys, come on, we've seen it already, right? So you would cause me naturally to become a little bit indifferent. And again, not truly having free will. So now this concept of not being able to remember, that's what I wanted to talk about, was all the way in the beginning of the chapter, text 5. And it is indeed a blessing, because without this ability to forget, we would have been paralyzed by all of our past experiences, good and bad. And we really truly act in free will. And it would not give us the chance to truly start over and choose to love Krishna sincerely. So I just wanted to bring that up, because I don't think we ever really covered, and I thought it was a powerful teaching that Tukaram gave us in the beginning of class.
Thank you. I agree.
Yeah, I come from the energy world, and people are always interested in past lives, and what they're really saying is they want you to tell them about the time when they were Cleopatra or a king in a past life, and and what they don't want to hear is, oh, you treated this person really poorly, and some sort of karmic timeline is playing out in this life. And so, yeah, I think it is a blessing to have amnesia, because otherwise the karmic storylines would never get resolved. It's like, oh, I'm never hanging out with you, I'm avoiding you, and it'd be a mess. So
psychologically, all the different categories we create in order to navigate the world, they do help us in some aspects, but in other aspects, they render our ability to truly be open and love everybody, because you see a certain race or certain ethnicity or certain type of people or situations, and you categorize them like, oh yeah, I've seen that. So there will be no room for you to ever explore a new path, because you would have this outview of life that, oh, I already know where that leads to. You have all these categories that have already been made up in your psychology, and you would never truly act in free will. So I think that Krishna is not really trying to defend his this position of ours. He's not saying, hey, you guys can't remember and look how inferior you are. He kind of just make that statement and move on, which leaves it open to interpretation. And certainly that was my first interpretation. It's like, oh, that's bad. You know, I can't remember stuff. That's a defect on how a healthy mind would operate. intelligence, memory. I would remember things. So I always looked at that as a defect, but it's actually, and another reason why I wanted to bring it up is because every time I read Gita or any other scripture, Bhagavad and so on, I'm really trying to pay attention to the things that Krishna does and the things that he is doing for our benefit, whether practically or just talking to Arjuna. And this is another point. He's not really trying to take credits for it. He's like, hey, I prevent you from remembering all the bad stuff you've done. Look how great I am. He just makes that point and moves on. But that again speaks and highlights to Krishna's mercy to us, how merciful he is, knowing that we would be paralyzed. I mean, I can think in this lifetime, some actions that I have committed, which I regret. I try to live my life in a way that I never regret anything I do. But unfortunately, and especially prior to coming into Krishna consciousness without bona fide knowledge, I am aware of things that I've done that I regret. And that's just in this lifetime. What you speak of past worst things that I have done, I would still carry the heaviness of that memory with me. And Krishna allows me to forget all of that and start fresh with the true possibility to exercise my free will and the true possibility to love everybody around me, every living thing around me, and start fresh. So it's again a kind of an act of kindness and mercy from Krishna to us.
Yeah, such good points, guys. And I think it's really nice that we don't just completely forget. Like, we forget the details, but because we have karma, we are experiencing some of those reactions to those actions that we may not remember. So it's like a sweet middle, you know? It's like we don't remember all the terrible details, and even not just the terrible, the really great stuff that we could have lived through, that we would have been so attached to too, but that we are experiencing the consequences of those actions in such a way that's like paired with knowledge. So the knowledge that Krishna consciousness gives us, it's enough for us to be like, okay, the good and the bad, they're reactions. I know that because of this knowledge. So I just shouldn't be attached to the good or the bad, and I should just try to transcend them. And so through knowledge, it's like we're still getting what we wanted, good and bad, because of our action. But at the same time, we get a roadmap to understanding those things, even though we don't have the details. And I think that's like such a powerful combination, that it's not that Krishna just spares us altogether. Although he would want to do that, he knows as a perfect parent that we won't learn the lesson if we don't get some consequences to the actions. And at the same time, he doesn't make us remember all the gruesome and the crazy good times. So it's just like right in the middle. And it's so therapeutic. And so this was such a good point. Thank you so much for bringing it up. And I think also one last thing is that right at that point is where we make the transition from pre-theism to theism. You know, that's when Krishna really introduces himself as God, low-key, but not so low-key too, you know. So prior to fourth, we know that he is somebody really great, right, and super wise. But then in the fourth chapter, right where Tadeo talked about, that's like where we're finding out, okay, Krishna's not just a normal, you know, person, and he's giving us a little bit more information that he's the supreme. And of course, that's going to continue to increase throughout the Gita from this point forward. But yeah, that is the junction or the transition from pre-theism to theism in the Gita, although it's not as straightforward.
Yeah. And then also how much in terms of his mercy and his forgiveness, because we cannot remember completely, as you pointed out, Varangi, all the gruesome stuff we've done, but he says, I can. And imagine how many mistakes we've done in past lives, some worse than others. You know, the number is really big. Every time that our scriptures use the expression innumerable lifetimes, when our scripture says innumerable, we're really thinking about trillions upon trillions, like many, 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 to the point which is innumerable. You cannot even put a number to it, right? And among all this missed use of free will, which characterizes as our incarnation, how many mistakes we've done. And then, yeah, Krishna is right there with us. He has forgiven us from all misactions, all bad actions we have engaged in, and still he's available to teach us and allow us to evolve. So he's not carrying a grudge and saying, oh, just look how many bad things you've done in the past. I remember them all, but I'm still here waiting to help you whenever you decide to turn to me.
Such a nice point. You know what? It makes me think, and I really appreciate in the Christian tradition how, you know, although it's a little weird that God has to send his son to get killed and all that stuff, and it has to be so like gruesome and sad. Besides that point, which it doesn't sit well with me, but just how even through it all, you know, Jesus dying on the cross for our sins, you know, it really gives me appreciation in that sense of, you know, God is so merciful and so loving and so forgiving that although he knew what we have done, what everybody does, you know, he's still offering that which is the most dear to him. And Jesus taking up everybody's sins and going through this terrible execution for the sake of others. It's such a beautiful example of selflessness and really imbibing what love of God is, you know. And so even if we're not Christian, even if we don't, you know, follow some of their teachings and stuff like that, we can still appreciate this concept of how we can become this type of person. But it all comes from the source of us, you know. He's all forgiving, all tolerant, all loving, that even he sends his son to take up all these people's sins, and he remembers them all, and we don't, and still this whole thing happens. And I was just like, wow, that's like, I can't think of a better example when it comes to maybe an instant or an example of that great love, and how we may not remember what we have done, but Krishna does. And even though he does, he's still so merciful and loving, and he knows that we're not that. We're not our mistakes, and we're not our illusion and our ignorance. He knows that we're a part of him. And so he just keeps trying to get us to take off that veil, right, from our face and really realize who we are as his eternal servants. Because only then can we actually be happy and love each other and transform this world. So yeah, it's beautiful. And I think that concept was brought up in one of Tukram's classes, not last night's, but in previous ones, how Krishna is really setting an example of the perfect human being. How can we live in this world and really not be entangled and contaminated by it? And I thought that was, yeah, it's like mind-blowing. And we have it all in this tradition. It's like so much heart and at the same time so much theology. And this is actually a point that's going to come up in the last chunk of the 4th chapter. So I'll save it.
Thank you, Varangi. Yeah, I loved last night's class, and especially the first 2 texts that Tukram unpacked, 39 and 40. And before we go into it, Tadeo or Varangi, do you want to read the texts?
Sure, I'll go for it. Text 39 reads, a faithful man who is dedicated to transcendental knowledge and who subdues his senses is eligible to achieve such knowledge. And having achieved it, he quickly attains the supreme spiritual peace. Text 40, but ignorant and faithless persons who doubt the revealed scriptures do not attain God consciousness. They fall down. For the doubting soul, there is no happiness neither in this world nor in the next. So these 2 verses combined, it's really a part that Tukram focused on. So we'll come back and expand on these 2 verses together. But just to finish it, because only there's 2 texts left in the chapter now. So text 41 reads, one who acts in devotional service, renouncing the fruits of his actions, and whose doubts have been destroyed by transcendental knowledge, is situated factually in the self. Thus, he is not bound by the reactions of work or conqueror of riches. And text 42, the last text of chapter 4. Therefore, the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance should be slashed by the weapon of knowledge. Armed with yoga or bharata, stand and fight.
I love that last one. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, so let me introduce what it is that Tukaram saw from 39 and 40, and then we can all expand on it together from what we got from his teachings. 39 is talking about a man of faith, a person of faith, let's say, right? A person of faith that is dedicated to this knowledge. And then 40, it says, but an ignorant and faithless person who doesn't have faith in the scriptures. So the point that Tukaram introduced is that when we start speaking about faith, we should have faith in this knowledge. We should have faith in this book, the knowledge in this book. And if we do have faith in it, then something good will happen to us, the transcendental peace in this instance. But in general, our spiritual advancement will take place. And Krishna is now here saying, hey, faith is going to be required. It's a part of the journey. And if you do have it, then that's good. You're in the right path. But if you don't have faith, he even characterizes a person as being ignorant. So if you are ignorant and faithless, and you doubt our scriptures, then you're not going to be happy either in this life or the other. So the central theme of these two verses combined is faith. If you have it, it's good. If you don't have it, it's bad. You're ignorant and so on. And he linked this idea of faith with the general concept of Christianity, where, again, all three of us here, we have a Christian background, and we know how faith is such a centerpiece of the Christian theology. However, I think we all also have this bad taste in our mouth about having a somewhat dogmatic faith or a blind faith, or faith on something which we truly don't understand, or faith in something that if we try to understand and if we try to do the math, and I'm speaking about Christian theology here, the math doesn't really add up, or at least it doesn't seem like that there's no one. I mean, it does seem like there's no one who can truly explain the math and show it how it all adds up. So then faith...
Or it's based on fear, right?
Correct. Have faith that what our book is saying is true, because if you don't, you're going to go to hell forever. And who wants to go to hell forever, right? So that faith, which has been expanded on in the West, it carries this, at least I think to all of us here and to our congregation at large, it's a bad ending. It doesn't seem to be something powerful. So I'm a little bit repulsed by it from the beginning. And that's exactly what Tukaram brought up. It's like, hey, it sounds like Christian. You know, have faith in our book, and if you don't, you're going to go to hell forever. And that's what you need. So then he presented it that way, which we can still understand faith from a different perspective and use it, even in Krishna consciousness, to allow us to make progress. So that's what happened here. So do you guys want to jump in and start expanding on it? How we can rescue the concept of faith?
Go ahead, Kim.
I thought he did such a good job. I was so amused by his phrasing of Christianesque with these verses, because maybe it's because I'm so trained to the Christian way of thinking that kind of went over my head a little bit. And then I looked at the verses like, oh yeah, it is a little Christian-y. So I thought he did such an elegant job of unpacking and troubleshooting these verses. And especially like with just the first verse 39, where if you never put your faith in something higher, something spiritual, then you're never going to evolve or elevate out of where you are in the material world if you're just focused at that level. And I thought that was a very powerful sentiment that he made. And one of the lectures that I remember from him when I started going to Laguna Temple that really stood out to me and made an impact on me was he was talking about how our tradition is just so sound philosophically. And, it's like logic, approach it in a good way and learn our tradition, learn our basic philosophy. But then at some point, you have to make that leap of faith and put your faith in the masters, the spiritual teachers, the gurus who've come before us, and kind of rely on what they say for things you don't know about beyond that. And I thought, oh, that makes sense. Like, get your feet wet, figure out that things work out logically, it makes sense. And then at some point, you have to take that leap and say, yeah, I have faith in the rest of the tradition that these gurus stand on.
Wonderful. Two good points. I did when I went to when I read these two texts, I was like, oh, that sounds weird. So I'm glad that he problematized them and also went on to work them out, because I thought his explanation was brilliant. Also, it was really practical, and because he compared it to our material life and how it actually, the resolution to these two, to unpacking these two verses, actually also works in material life and spiritual life. So it's both, it's sound in both circumstances. And we're here and we want to go there. So of course that's like, sign me up for this, right? And so he was talking about how faith, first of all, it's something that it doesn't just happen overnight. It's not instant. If it is, you should be scared. It's like blind faith. Also, it's part of a relationship. And also that there's nothing in the world, like there's no reality where faith isn't a component. So faith has to be there for everything and anything that we do, either in material life or in spiritual life. And he gave several examples. One of them was how, investment, for those of you that are interested, and I think we should all be to some extent, on how to take care of our money and how to live. It's okay, you can live with it. Thank you. It's okay. How to live without any, like comfortably doing our duty and stuff like that. So he was talking about investment and what's the smartest way to know where you can put your money. And I thought this was a great example, because it wasn't something that's like, oh, you just go with whatever comes out first. It's like, no, you use your intelligence, your resources, you talk to people, you figure it out, like have a goal in mind, and then you pick and choose where you want to put your money. But once you do that, there is some faith that wherever you're going to invest, that it's going to give you something in return that's like worth your time and money and energy. And with that, he expanded it to relationships, to even just common courtesy with other people that you don't know personally, but that you just accept that they're good. And so this concept of faith really permeates every aspect of life, and how it's ridiculous to think that we can live in this world and not trust in something higher than ourselves. And like Kim mentioned, if we actually don't want to trust in something higher than ourselves, then we're really missing out on the opportunity to transcend this material world, because we're here. So we actually naturally need to have faith in something spiritual to be able to transcend this bubble of illusion in which we find ourselves. And so I personally thought, this is my own realization from that class, was that verse 39, it's like a formula on how to work through our trust issues. Really, it's like Krishna saying, hey, you need to put some skin in the game. But also, you heard from me a little bit. So it's like, let's build a relationship. Have initial trust and faith so that I can take you on this journey. Otherwise, it's just not going to mean the same if you're like, I don't know if you're really a hobo or if you're actually God. It's like, you got to like, at a certain point, decide, okay, what you've said sounds like you actually could be God. Like, I have some faith, take me on this journey. Or like, no, you're just a crazy person. and I shouldn't trust you at all. So far, Krishna has given enough details to convince me and a lot of us that what he's saying holds water, and that he can, in fact, give us things that can transform our lives completely. And then, verse 40, I thought was just the other side of it. And Krishna in the Gita does this a lot. And I know this is something that Tukram has brought up in a multitude of other classes, is that a way in teaching in Sanskrit is to explain what is and what is not. And I think that Krishna here is doing that. 39 is saying, this is what you get if you invest this much, and this is what you don't get if you don't want to invest and you want to act like a fool. And so ignorance, and this is something Tukram pointed out, was that ignorance isn't like, oh, just not knowing. It was meant to highlight weakness of heart, and weakness of heart really is not being strong enough philosophically, even not having a strong community and coaching, so that you just weak out of the greatest thing that can happen in your life. So ignorance is not just like, oh, I didn't know. This ignorance that Krishna's talking about in verse 40 is more of weakness of heart, of like being afraid, not committing, standing on the fence, not really taking a step forward. And he mentioned, we can all think of so many people where they just spend their whole life just being in the middle and like being neutral. And it's like, I don't know, I'd rather not ruffle some feathers. But even that is a choice. You're choosing to not act. That is still action. And I thought that was really powerful. So the combination of these two verses, it was like, yeah, I have so much faith that if I get up from bed, I'm not going to float to the ceiling. It's like, I just have faith that there's like the gravity, law. And that if I step out of my house, that there is not going to be a lion waiting for me to step in, into danger or stuff like that, that my car is going to function when I turn it on and I drive. There's some faith in everything that we decide to do. And his presentation was really practical, and it made sense. So that's my 2 cents on those two.
I can only echo what you guys have said, because it's already complete. And 2 examples that he brought up that I like to mention was that, well, let me take a step back. So what was powerful for me was how natural faith became, being very attracted to the science of self-realization, or the philosophy of our tradition, the theology of our tradition, and really focusing in that area. But then now faith became quite natural. It was something that I didn't think I would need, or something that would help me. Like, no, I don't want to have faith in something. I want to know something. If I know something, I don't have to have faith in that something. So that's the mentality I come with. But then through last night's class, faith became very natural because of the various reasons that you guys just elaborated on so nicely, that it is a part of everything. And I'm not going to repeat everything that you guys just said, because it's really complete. But the one example that he didn't mention that got to me was that even in terms of ourselves, for example, we have people that we love, and we would expect that they trust us, which means that we expect others to have faith in us. And yet, it is not really determined whether or not we are going to act according to their expectations or not. And yet, we expect people to have faith in us, that we are going to do the right thing, that we are going to be a good friend, that we are going to be there to help them if they need. We expect that. So we even expect others to have faith in us. So it is everywhere, in every corner of life, faith is an absolute component of everything we do. I like how you use the word investment, Varangi, because that every time you make an investment, faith is immediately present. We invest in university education. There's no possible way for us to determine exactly what's going to happen with the education that we acquire from a university. We do not know, but we do know that University XYZ has reputation ABC, and that if I go there and get a degree from that university, something good is going to happen to me. You don't know what that something good is. And in fact, it is against statistics, which shows that 60% of people that graduate, even with a master's degree, they don't work in that field they graduated in. So yeah, you had faith that you would go to that university, you would attain that degree, and you would work in that area. There was no way that you could possibly predict that. In fact, the odds would be against you if you try to predict. But you did nevertheless had faith that you would go there, you would acquire that knowledge, and you would act in a particular industry according to the education you got. So faith became quite natural. It's part of everything we do. And then the other experience I had was that, and you guys already mentioned this, I just want to repeat it. At some point, after you have been exposed to a theology, to a concept, to a hypothesis, and those propositions were very valid, to say as precise as I can, right? Something valid means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. That's valid, right? So if you have done the math, if you have become familiar with the hypothesis enough so that you understand where the opportunities are pointing to, what is the hypothesis, you have done that for quite some time, and you have seen people that embodies that philosophy, that hypothesis, and you appreciate that is something honorable, and they are attaining the transcendental peace that Krishna is talking about. They are becoming more indifferent to the comings and goings of material life, and the results are showing up. Then at which point do we let go of our skepticism and embrace a higher possibility based on faith, even though you're not there yet? There is enough examples, there is enough sound results that would still require faith from you because you are not there. You look around at your gurus and your teachers, they are there. They are standing in that transcendental position, but you are not. But you've been around for some time, right? And that's actually a requirement. You should have been around for some time, because otherwise, like Varangi pointed out, it does become blind faith. But if you have been around for a while, you've seen the people, the math adds up, you're not there yet. The only thing that is missing is that final energy, that final reason for you to continue on this path, even though you don't have it yet. That is faith. You're going to embrace it on the accounts of faith, that if I continue, I will also attain the results, the spiritual results that my peers have, and that will be faith. So I thought that it was very valuable in the sense that now, at least personally for me, I can also use faith. I understand it better. I realize that it is natural, and it will be, hopefully it will become a part of something that continues to help me and hopefully everybody else in the path to spiritual realization, to spiritual knowledge.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I almost think that, well, at least I'll just speak for myself, the word faith might have some negative connotation, and so people just immediately get a little skeptical when the word comes up. But the way you two have given so many examples about how we have actions and examples of faith play out in our day-to-day material lives, then it becomes less of an F word, so to speak. So, yeah, and I really related to the text, his ideas around text 40 about, okay, so the people who are paralyzed by doubt and fear, and how they're probably never going to not only go very far in life, but just not be happy when you're not putting your faith in something higher. And so that really stood out to me too.
Yeah, this idea of something higher is also there, right? Because we all are in the position we are. Let's say this is our standing point where we stand currently. And we can either continue to be here where we currently stand, or we can aim for something higher. If you aim for something higher, you're naturally going to have faith. First of all, that there's something higher exists and that you can attain it. So it becomes quite natural.
So true. And then a natural question would be, well, then how do we get rid of those doubts? How do we continue to build faith, or even start building faith? And then Krishna answers that on text 41. Those doubts, that person who acts in devotional service, obviously, I think even here, the Sanskrit is yoga, connection, right? Connecting your works to something higher, right? Renouncing the fruits of his actions in whatever way, wherever you are, whatever level that is, right? And whose doubts have been destroyed by transcendental knowledge. And so we hear that by cultivating knowledge, that's the only way we can actually destroy those doubts. And we don't hear from Krishna that it's something that, oh, you should just give up your doubts, or you should just have faith. It's saying by transcendental knowledge. It's like, how amazing is that? It's such a complete package.
Or if you don't have faith, you're going to go to hell forever.
Exactly.
You don't hear Krishna,
right? Right. It's just giving us a formula of how we can develop that faith, how we can get started. And if you're halfway there, how we can continue to the end, how to maintain, keep yourself in this process. I think it's really easy, relatively easy, to come to something like this, to this tradition, for example. But it's much harder to stay in it, right? And so this formula, I think, applies to the beginner, to the intermediate, and to the advanced practitioner. That we should always be investing whatever amount of faith we have in cultivating transcendental knowledge, because that knowledge will protect us from making sentimental choices, right? Blind faith choices or blind doubt choices. And we could be like, the greatest thing you gain, you're going to miss out on that, or you could make the worst decision of your whole life and regret it for many lifetimes, just by not taking the time to do your due diligence, right? We talk about this in material life. Do your due diligence before you open up business, or before you invest, or before you get to know somebody, before you marry somebody, anything like that. Big choices require a little bit of, not a little bit, a lot of research and information, and for you to step into that lab and try it out. And so here, Krishna's saying, those doubts will be destroyed by the cultivation of not just any knowledge. It's not like, oh, you just go to college and then those big doubts of life are going to be resolved. We've all been there. My doubts were not resolved until I came across the Bhagavad Gita and the community of people that live it. That's when I realized, oh, what death is really about, who I really am, what I'm supposed to be doing with my time and efforts. And those big questions in life were actually answered through transcendental knowledge, not just any knowledge, right? And then that person is situated factually in the self, in knowing who they are really, besides the name, the nationality, the gender, the social status, the economic status, the Instagram followers, their influencer status, etc. Thus, he is not bound by the reactions of work. So if somebody can check these boxes, or at least have those as the goals in life, then this person will surely still be able to work in this world, but not be bound by the reactions. He's going to be transcendental. And I think I want to correct myself now, because earlier I had said, we're in this world, but we want to go there. And I think this really corrects that. It's not that we want to go there. We can be there here. And I think this is a huge point that at least I'm still getting used to. After a decade of studying, I still fall into that trap of thinking I want to go there. Like that's my goal. No, that goal is here. Why? Because I'm a spiritual being, and by chanting, I know you guys covered that. By chanting the holy names, Krishna's names, God's names, and whatever other tradition you follow. But in chanting, we connect with who we truly are and with that source of everything, so we can actually be transcendental without having to die, without having to renounce our family, without having to renounce our work, without having to be this like extremist person that's going to go kill everybody else because that's the only way to get to heaven, And so it's really like a practical way. So I wanted to correct myself for that, because in this verse, like Krishna says, you can be in this world and not be bound by the reactions of that labor. And of course, that last, I don't know if you guys want to comment on text 41 or move right.
I do have a comment, Varangi, on what you said. And first of all, I want to acknowledge you that I hadn't considered text 41 to be an answer to the question of faith, like, oh, how do I cultivate faith? Because Krishna now, 39 and 40, as we just covered, he's talking about faith. And he, 41, like you mentioned, he's saying, okay, but then now how do you do it, right? How do you have more of that faith and let go of these doubts? I never read 41 as an answer to that doubt that may naturally arises when we're talking about faith. And as you're reading it, I think I saw a parallel, which is what I wanted to share, which is also the other verse you mentioned earlier in the class about the guru. And Krishna is saying that we should approach our guru, our spiritual master, and provide or give, act in devotional service, provide service to the guru. And then what you get in return from the guru is not a business transaction. It's not like, hey, I'm giving you this, guru, and then now you're going to give me the other thing. Where is it, right? So it's not, right. It's a loving relationship where you engage with a loving spirit with your guru. And the guru, because he's kind and knowledgeable, full of transcendental knowledge and merciful by nature, he's going to reciprocate with you, which is natural in a loving relationship. But it does start from us being humble, submissive, and inquiring from our guru, but also engaging in providing devotional service to the guru. But then it is said, even in that verse, that the guru, because he's merciful and because he has transcendental knowledge, he's going to give you that transcendental knowledge. And this verse is almost so parallel to that, because it's saying, hey, one who acts in devotional service. We can certainly read acting in devotional service for my guru, because I'm serving my guru with devotional service. Renouncing the fruits of his action and whose doubt has been destroyed by transcendental knowledge. Well, the transcendental knowledge, we can say we are cultivating, but we can also say is the mercy of our guru. Now that I have given my guru devotional service, my guru is giving me back, because it's merciful and because this is a loving relationship, transcendental knowledge. And that transcendental knowledge is going to squash the doubts that I have. So I couldn't help but just parallel. So I wanted to mention that here.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. That was, Rangi, that was a nice realization from text 41, and just phrasing it in that way is like, oh, okay, so what does this look like? Because I didn't look at that verse either, text 41, as having that reaction. Like, there's so much instruction in it, which is nice. So, and yeah, just to echo what you were just saying today, how do you do it? For me, I'm not officially initiated yet, but aspiring. But starting from someone who starts going to the temple, gaining knowledge, and how do you gain knowledge through others? What you were saying earlier, Varangi, learning knowledge from others, having faith in your teachers, and then it just starts the process from there.
Yeah, thank you so much for injecting that previous verse into this. I think it completes it. Without it, wouldn't be complete not interpretation, but understanding of verse 41. And we could see how Krishna, verse 34 is proceeding. So he continues to add on. And so when he talks about transcendental knowledge, we should already understand, yes, that's something I get from my gurus. It's not something that we just cultivate on our own. And I think this is the mark of a devotee, always realizing that we're not doing everything just on our own. Some part of it, yes, we take credit for, but most of it is by grace that we receive it. And what's the ticket to buy that grace? Obviously that you can't buy it with anything material, but the ticket to buy that grace is service. And we can do service. You can pretend to be doing service for a little bit, right? But eventually it doesn't work out. So to do that service, we just have to have sincerity. And that sincerity is enough to get us started on this path to, take up a regulative way of working, of being a part of a active and helpful community. And, little by little, through that cultivation of knowledge, with all those components in place, then you start deepening your knowledge. And the more you deepen that knowledge, the more knowledge you get, and then it's infinite. And then we see examples of our gurus, just they're walking knowledge pots, infinite, like they don't have any ending, and they just keep, every class they can talk about the same topic and something new is always coming out, flowing out. And so at a certain point they become that knowledge, right? And anybody that comes close and sits close is able to participate in that cycle of knowledge and of ever-growing devotion, I think so. And then we get the action punch, from Krishna.
It again highlights what we were discussing earlier in regards to faith, that having done your math, having been around for a while, you step in faith, right? So to me highlights that again, because it's saying, hey, you are acting in devotional service. So with a loving attitude, you are serving your guru. That's something you do. Then your guru, because they have transcendental knowledge, due to their service to their guru for decades, they are not going to give it to you. So that's the part of grace. So when you look at that as a concept, there's something we are doing with a loving spirit. And so then our actions, but then there's also grace, which is something that our merciful guru is giving it to us. When I examine this proposition, it sounds very reasonable. It sounds like, yes, it makes sense. I'm engaging in loving service towards a person who is very wise. That person is merciful by nature, and they're going to give me some of that transcendental knowledge in return. It sounds like a very healthy relationship. It sounds like something that, having done the math for a while, I can say, yes, the little gaps, the gray areas, which I can't predict how exactly going to be, I'm going to take that on faith. It sounds like a very reasonable relationship that Krishna is painting here. And to engage in that with faith seems quite reasonable.
Yeah.
And then there's our last text, which is so beautiful. So then it's almost like, I love when Krishna says that, right? When he starts a text with the word therefore, because it implies that we've covered some ground, that there was a hypothesis, some premises and so on. And then now here's the conclusion, right? Therefore, the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance should be slashed by the weapon of knowledge. Armed with yoga, O Bharata, stand and fight.
In case it wasn't clear.
In case it wasn't clear, right?
What should we do? Engage in our duties.
Yes. And so, and it is said in such a philosophical, scientific, and poetic way that only Krishna could say it like that, right?
Yeah, I love it. I love how like Tukram touched on this point, which was, you know, they're in the middle of a battlefield. So it's like, I got carried away. I forget that they're like in the middle of a war because he's just speaking so beautifully. And it's like, okay, let me take some notes. Like I'm chilling in my living room and it's like, yeah, it's all nice. My incense. It's like, then Krishna's like, yeah, now fight. It's like, oh yeah, they're back. Oh my gosh, he's going to fight his family. That's like how this whole thing started. So it's like, it's really amazing. Like when you think about it, it's like a movie, but it's like in parts and super profound and you can gain so much from every episode. And sometimes you forget where you're at and then Krishna brings you back and really reminds you that, you know, for somebody like me, not only like, okay, that's where Arjuna and Krishna are, but it's like, I'm also in the middle of a war. We all are. We don't know when I'm going to have to exit my body, this world, my relationships, my bank account, my whatever. So it's like that urgency, right? I got that from this last verse. It was like, wow, this is urgent. We're in the middle of a battlefield, of a war against my own demons, my own opponents, my own things. Like it's now or never. Right now, I'm getting so much knowledge. It's time to act. Not tomorrow, not next week. It's like, from what we have heard so far, how can I implement that into my life right now? Because it's time to fight. Like now is the time. It's about to start. So yeah, I love that you mentioned the therefore, because I also get that like my ears kind of perk up. It's like, okay, he's going to say something. Like, okay, therefore, tying it all up. And I appreciated you commenting on that.
Yeah, because Arjuna is expressing so many of his doubts, right, so far. How about this? How about that? In chapter 2, in fact, I think chapter 1 a little bit, but chapter 2, certainly he's presenting so many doubts, so many reasons why he shouldn't fight. And again, this is very tricky, I would say, and I think is very appropriate to the topics we're discussing today. Krishna is asking Arjuna to get up and fight, to go and kill people. It is so jihadist like, right? If you have not done the math, if you have not been around the tradition to truly understand what's actually going on, it's like, okay, God is asking me to go and kill people. Come on, we are back to the same religious warfares that we have heard so far. And it's like, how are we any different, right? But at the same time, Krishna does have a plan. He does come, like he said he would, when a predominant rise of irreligion takes place and irreligion is ruling the world. Out of his mercy, he will come to handle it. And that's what he was here for. Now, the context of Gita, like we have already explained, is such that really highlights how this war was really necessary. Again, we have to be familiar with what happened that led to this war, but it essentially got to a point where it was like, okay, all the bad people, all the bad guys with bad intentions, angry, lusty, greedy people would dominate the world. And there was no rescue. There was no, the army of one country and another country were going to get together and fight against all these bad elements and peace would reign again. That wouldn't happen. It was like what Krishna is saying at that time, when nobody has a solution, then because I am merciful, because I care, then I'll come and I will set things straight. So that's what's happening. That's what Krishna is doing here. And then now he's asking Arjuna to take upon the ultimate faith. Just have faith in everything that we just covered here and go fight. Even though you had doubts before, those doubts were a bit ignorant. I have now given you transcendental knowledge. Armed with that knowledge, go and fight, because it's the right thing to do. But I think he really highlights that, but you shouldn't do that unless you really have done your homework, unless the person who's talking to you really has transcendental knowledge, which requires discrimination on your own part. How do you know that the person from whom you are accepting teachings is actually teaching you transcendental knowledge, loving, and that loving knowledge, right? And that is actually for your real benefits. But having done that, I think it's part of the lessons that we can get here. Having arrived at that conclusion, having done the homework, having seen the hypothesis and a matching result, have some faith and go even fight. As hard as that would be, our faith is going to be well, okay, I am going to dedicate the next hour and 45 minutes to chant 16 rounds. I'm going to have faith that this process does work, that is part of devotional service. And by doing this, I'm going to not only attain self-realization for myself, but hopefully for others around me. That's our faith. We're going to have faith in that. Arjuna had to embrace a much higher faith to do it, you know, based on this transcendental knowledge that he acquired from the supreme teacher. So, and I think it's a wonderful way to close the chapter. It embraces so much that we have learned so far. It does require Arjuna to go now in faith and fight. And also I can see that the degree to which you acquire transcendental knowledge would be related to the degree of the faith you would have to act upon something difficult. Mm-hmm. And Arjuna was called to act on something that would be perhaps the most difficult for any reasonable human being to engage in, which is to go and kill and fight against people that you love. And he had to have a really strong faith in order to be able to do that and let go of his doubts. So to the extent of the higher the faith, the higher the transcendental knowledge. And then if we analyze the transcendental knowledge that Krishna has given him, you know, is sufficient for Arjuna to get up and act upon that faith and let go of his doubts. So, and it shows how merciful Krishna is also. He's there, presence, giving Arjuna all the transcendental knowledge he requires to engage in what would be the most difficult thing, not only for him, but also all of us.
Yeah. And how really you can't act appropriately and boldly unless you have knowledge to back it up. Like Arjuna would never be able to fight for the right reasons, completely detached, if he didn't have that knowledge. So knowledge, transcendental knowledge, is absolutely required to win at this game of life.
Exactly.
You know, and make it out alive and bring others with you. You can't live for something that's worth living for without knowing the right reason behind it, you know? And so it's wonderful to see devotees depart this world. We just had one of our dear friends leave her body, die, and she's like around my age, and she was married and she was super young and like an amazing devotee. And she set such a beautiful example of how a Vaishnava in general really should leave this world, and with the help of her guru, you know, and her community and her husband. And just to see how these devotees are living their lives, how they're really dedicating their whole life for Krishna consciousness, but also even their death, they're dedicating it to Krishna consciousness. And how do we do that? Well, they're setting an example of how to gracefully exit this world at any age. You know, we have devotees leaving their bodies when they're really old, really young, like a lot of money, not so much money, a lot of degrees, barely materially educated, just from every aspect of life, as long as their devotional service has been cultivated. We see the same departure, the same mood at departure. And that's really why we're doing all of this, to be able to pass that last test, right? And it's amazing how you can't really do any of that unless you have knowledge, and you can't get knowledge without your spiritual master, right? And you can't really get a spiritual master unless you have a community that helps you work out your hangups and your issues and your trust issues, and that impart knowledge, even from the Gita. So many people have the Bhagavad Gita. We distribute it freely around the world. So many people have it at their homes and they're not practicing. So it's not to say that the Bhagavad Gita isn't sacred and powerful in and of itself, but it's to highlight the importance of hearing Bhagavad Gita from somebody that embodies it, that lives it, you know. And we're so fortunate to have Tukram Prabhu giving us this weekly, not weekly, it's like pretty much every day, because he gives talks and posts almost daily, classes daily on this transcendental knowledge, and we're so close to that. You know, we're so fortunate, and it's really it comes full circle. We have everything we need to be able to fight and become victorious in this battle, just like we see Arjuna doing. And yeah, it's such a blessing. So thank you so much. It's such a wonderful talk.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you both. I learned so much today in addition to Friday's class. So, and I love the end of the chapters because they feel like such cliffhangers. Like, oh, what's going to happen next? So, looking forward to next week.
Is Arjuna going to fight, or is he going to be like, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's crazy to think, right? This is only chapter 4. There are 18 chapters. It's like, what else do we have to learn? You know, there's so much more yet to come, and it makes it very exciting.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both for your time, and thank you all to the new listeners and the regular listeners. And we appreciate you tuning in each week, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Hare Krishna.